Welcome everybody to the latest edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This is a show I've been looking forward to for so long. The guy we're going to be interviewing today is somebody whose work has fascinated me for many, many years. I first came across his work probably around about 3 or 4 years ago, when I came across, when I was particularly fascinated by the idea of reality as a computer simulation. Now, as many of you will know, over the years, my ideas have changed somewhat. In my first book, Is There Life After Death? The Amazing Science of What Happens When We Die, or the Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die. It's not that amazing unless you find my work amazing. But in this, I suggest that at the point of death, we start to live in an inwardly generated simulation of our lives, which I call the Bohmian IMAX. And in this, I suggested at that time that we start to relive our lives in a similar way to a first-person computer game. And in this first-person computer game, the information that we perceive, the reality that we perceive, is actually a form of information that I apply some of the ideas of Professor David Bohm and other individuals. But what I was suggesting was that this information is drawn up internally from an information field within the brain. Now, initially, I put forward the idea that the human brain itself has a facility whereby it can record every event within your life. And therefore, when you approach death, those recordings, you start to relive them again in an internally generated recreation of your life, a groundhog life, if you like. But over the years, my position on this has changed, and it's become what I would believe is slightly more sophisticated, in the sense I came across the work of individuals like Nick Bostrom, for example, in terms of the simulation argument, and it began to intrigue me because I thought this is probably the way it should be going. This is a hypothesis that very much matches my own and complements my own very powerfully. Now, I have to say, of all the writers that are out there who have been writing about this subject, in my opinion, Jim Elvidge, our guest today, is the guy that has been doing it in the way I have a great feeling of complementarity in terms of what I'm writing about. Now, Jim himself is an engineer. He has a master's degree in electrical engineering from Cornell University. He's been a leader of technological advances for many, many years within business. He's also worked in enterprise management. He's a fascinating character. And what I'd like to do is to now say hi to Jim and say welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Anthony. It's really great to talk to you. We've, traded some emails and messages over the years, and finally I get a chance to talk face to face. So it's a real privilege for me, and I'm honored to be on your show.
Wonderful. Now, what I'd like to do, Jim, is that I'm pretty sure that a lot of the listeners out there are probably aware in general of your work anyway. But I think for those listeners who aren't, I think a very, very brief synopsis, well, not that brief, actually, because I think it's important you expand on your ideas, is exactly in the universe explained, what is the background to it, and what is it that makes you conclude very, very powerfully that we are actually experiencing ourselves within some form of computer simulation, from the background, from the work of Nick Bostrom onwards, and then a little bit about your unique take on that as well. So for about 5 or 10 minutes, if you can just explain this to the listeners, and then you and I can get into what I'm really looking forward to is a really interesting chat about the evidence for this and where we can take it logically in the future.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for that intro, and I enjoy being referred to as a character, so that was perfect. My goal in writing this book was initially completely different, but as I started doing the research for it, I started to uncover research that other people had done, results of experiments and so forth that led me down this path. So it was very much empirical. It was very much based on things that had happened, things that I found out about, that I learned about over the years, and I'm talking maybe 15 years or so. I've always been kind of a truth seeker and always a little in favor of something a little bit different, anomalous occurrences or anomalous research, things that people are doing. I was interested very early on in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics because it was different from the Copenhagen one. So I got, very focused on that. And over the years, I just kind of expanded my knowledge. But what I think has happened is that I've realized that if you look at our world, our reality, our universe with a very open and take things that people experience and take scientific research that has been done properly and sum it all up, you realize, as I know you do, Anthony, that the deterministic, realism type of world with objective reality isn't quite right. And there has to be something else going on. Quantum mechanics shows this very, very clearly. So what is that something else that's going on? And what I was struck by some of the work of, as you mentioned, Nick Bostrom, there are others, Philip K. Dick explored some of these ideas in the past, and other people, struck by some of their work that maybe were part of a simulation. And I began to think, well, is there evidence for that? And so the purpose of the book really was to explore the categories of evidence for it. And I went into the book with no particular agenda, just doing the research and trying to find out what evidence there is. So what comes out of all of this is, if you think in terms of like a Venn diagram of anomalies where certain types of theories, certain theories of everything can explain certain anomalies. And if you imagine where all those Venn diagrams intersect, they intersect in something that I call the consciousness-driven digital reality model. It seems as if our reality is digital, deep down, and we'll get into some of the reasons for that, it's extremely inefficient, and whether it's designed or whether it evolved, it would make sense that it would evolve in an efficient way. And so it's probably digital, which means that everything ultimately is data, and it doesn't mean that that's a cold and calculating model. The fact that books are data, and we have, very rich and exciting books to read, and, warm movies and experiences and things like that. It's just that deep down, your reality appears to be digital. And consciousness, the second part of this, is that consciousness doesn't appear to emanate from the brain, as you've probably come to that conclusion with your most recent book. I've also come to that conclusion doing research as well, that consciousness is somewhere else. And so that allows a lot of possibilities. We don't have to store all of these, simulation possibilities in our gray matter. They can be out there in the Akashic record. So I think that's probably about 5 minutes. There's much more to dive into here, and I have to apologize in advance, Anthony, if you see a cat walk across my keyboard, but I'm trying to keep her away.
I know there's an animation of the archons is the cat. By the way, people, I love cats. They're my favorite animals, so please don't take that wrongly. One of the things I like about your work, Jim, is that you're very similar to myself in that when I started writing, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to any prior beliefs I had. The conclusions I came to in my writing were purely and simply from my own research and my own analysis of the information. And I know that over the years, my position has changed. And I was listening to one of your interviews recently, and you very much intimated exactly the same idea, that I don't necessarily believe 100% that this is the case, but it is the evidence is compelling for me, because it at least explains why consciousness or what is exactly going on around us and the anomalies that we perceive. Now, one of the things that I'd love you to explain, because I've heard you explained it before, and I think that probably you are the most effective explanator of Nick Bostrom's hypothesis about the simulation argument, and the idea that the evidence is fairly compelling that we are in a simulation that has been modeled by a future civilization. What I'd like you to do is just explain a little bit about Bostrom's 3 options that he thinks humanity may develop in terms of Moore's law and the capacity for processes to process information. So you could explain a little bit about this and then expand a little bit more on how you've expanded upon that idea.
Okay, sure, great. One aside here, Anthony, is that it's interesting that Moore's law seems to be flattening out lately. It isn't flattening out necessarily in terms of transistor density, but transistor density is creating heat problems, so they can't actually clock CPUs at faster and faster rates. CPU speeds for your average computers now, desktop computers, haven't really changed over the past 8 years or so. So, and that, there's been a lot of assumption about Moore's law leading to a singularity and things like that. Moore's law is, kind of generally applied to the idea of a doubling every couple of years of technological capability. But really, it's only doubling the transistor density. It's not doubling the performance, which means, now we're not able to say, well, every 2 years we get a doubling of the ability to get closer to an AI, for example. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there that that does impact a little bit some of the times that are in Bostrom's argument and the singularity argument. So back to Nick Bostrom, he wrote this paper, the simulation argument, back in 1999 or 2001, somewhere around then. And basically what he's saying is that recognizing that at the state of technology we're at now, we are creating simulations. We're creating game-like simulations when we do things like World of Warcraft. We create sims for astronauts and fighter pilots to learn their craft and so forth. And they get better and better every year. And at some point, simulations generated by computer imagery and sound and so forth with the right headsets on or the right transducers that are interfacing with our bodies will be so realistic at some point that we won't be able to distinguish them from reality. And actually, you might think, well, that may be true, but we're always going to remember the time before we started the simulation. We know we put a headset on, we started a simulation or something like that. But that's not even necessarily true, because they're now experimenting with the ability to erase memories or suspend memories in animals. So at some point, we will probably be able to say, suspend our memories, wipe them clean, and store them after a simulation. So all those technological arguments are leading to the conclusion that at some point, we will probably get to the point where we can create simulations and experience things, historical simulations, living in different places, living on different planets, whatever we want to experience. And Bostrom calls that the post-human state. So his logical argument is either we're not there and we're never going to get there because we destroy ourselves before we get there, or we're not there and we're never going to get there because we choose not to get there, or we are there in the post-human state and we're creating these realities. And in that case, because we will create so many of these simulations, the likelihood that we're in one of them now is much stronger than the likelihood that we're not. So if you take his argument logically, if you're an optimist, then we're living in a simulation. If you're a pessimist, we're going to destroy ourselves in the next 20 years or so. And his third option of making the conscious choice not to pursue that technology, I kind of throw that one out. I mean, when have we ever not pursued nuclear energy or cloning or any of these nanotechnology, any of the other technologies that have a potential danger? We just do. We those. So there's no reason why we're not going to pursue AI or simulations as well. So that's his argument, and it comes to the conclusion that we're most likely living in a simulation. Now, I do have to say that his implication there is that the simulation's created by us in the future, and we're kind of, playing in that. I think one of the flaws to that is that why would we even really want to do that? If we're going to create a simulation for ourselves, we really want to go back 20 years or 50 years or something like that and see what it's like and play that out. I mean, what's the point of that? In fact, some of the evidence that we'll be talking about tonight points to a greater purpose that we have. There's no real great purpose in, being part or playing in a simulation where you're 20 years in the past or 50 years in the past. But there is a great purpose in evolving your consciousness, and that purpose, could be due to a different kind of simulation. I tend to not even like the word simulation because it implies that somebody's doing it in an artificial way, but, more like a digital programmatic reality. So the creator of this doesn't have to be us in the future. It could be an extraterrestrial, or it could be an AI, or it could be just the system itself, which I think is the most likely case, that the self is digital, has created this, what we call reality learning lab that we experience, and it evolves on its own according to some fundamental law.
Yeah, because this is intriguing, isn't it? It's quite fascinating, the idea that this is some form of simulation, and who is the person creating the simulation. Because I don't know if you've come across the work of Vlatko Vedrell at all, who's professor of physics at the University of Singapore. Jim, do you know of him?
No, I don't.
Okay, he's written a fascinating book, again, that is doing the physics of the idea of the simulation argument. And he very much takes the idea of information. He takes the David Bohm concept of information running on a computer. And he argues that effectively, people tend to assume a computer is the machine on a desk, but of course, a computer is anything that processes information in any particular way. And Vedrell is very, very similar to Bostrom in the sense that he says that logic must conclude that this must be some form of simulation, because if you go into the quantum physics and if you go into the subatomic particles themselves, and I know that you've mentioned this in one of your interviews, and it rang so true to me from my own ideas on this, that effectively, the vast majority to a vanishing number of decimal points is empty space. And in fact, if we actually then believe that quarks themselves are actually made of strings, and these strings themselves are just vibrations in a field, we start to realize that everything can be encoded digitally. And there's absolutely no reason why what we consider to be physical reality is in fact some form of internally brain-generated illusion. Of course, the argument then is the brain itself is within the illusion, so in other words, or within the system. But of course, for me, the major problem is, and it was something I put up on Facebook a few days ago, and it'd be interesting to just discuss this for a second, is there's one thing to say that we would have the computing power to be able to simulate people, simulate consciousness, simulate a reality, simulate a universe. But the difficult thing is, how do we simulate self-aware consciousness? In other words, we have this whole argument of the Turing test and everything else as to, just because I can simulate a brain and I can simulate all the processes in a brain and everything else, how does that then create self-conscious awareness? How does that create the ability of being me, or being Jim Elvidge, or being Radia Nunez? Have you any idea how we might explain that?
Yeah, the way I look at it is that our consciousness, and I have to give a nod to Tom Campbell here, because he's really developed these ideas very well, and I respect his work quite a bit. And it fits in, again, with a lot of the evidence that we're seeing. So in that model, our consciousness is actually, think of it like, all that there is, think of it as a big cloud, and our consciousness is like a segment of that cloud. You identify some molecules of water vapor or whatever, and you say, right there, that's Jim's consciousness. So that's cordoned off, and that is in some way that it's boundaried. And Anthony's is over here as well, all part of the greater global consciousness. So consciousness itself and self-awareness comes from the greater system. Why does it? What is it? Is a huge question, and something that that I can't answer. I don't know that anybody ever could answer. But if you take it from the standpoint that we know consciousness exists because we experience it, why couldn't we just say that consciousness is fundamental? And so that's Campbell's argument. The consciousness is part of the bigger system, and our individuated consciousness is just part of that. So this reality learning lab that we're experiencing is, say, an instance of the program, if you will, that allows us to interact with each other. All the conscious entities that connect to it essentially have consensus. So when we all see a blue car drive down the street, we all say, oh, yes, it's blue. If we didn't have that consensus, it would be like we were dreaming. We wouldn't believe anything. We wouldn't learn from it. We would think, oh, this is all an illusion, a fantasy in our minds. But the fact that there is a consensus with other conscious entities, other people that we interact with, makes us think that this reality is very hard and very objective, when quantum mechanics is telling us it really isn't deep down. But the apparent realness of it and the apparent hardness of it is enough for us to learn from it and to say, okay, I've just really experienced this. Something felt hard. Something smacked me in the face, whatever it is. I'm going to modify my behavior. I'm going to be more patient, more whatever. The goal is that we're trying to achieve in evolving ourselves. So the consciousness doesn't have to come from, from the program of the reality itself, but it's part of the greater system. And what creates it, I don't know. I think it's just fundamental, to be honest.
I think this is again coming back, isn't it, to both the Vedanta and to the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah would argue that everything that is just emanations of Ein Sof. You're then going to get the idea of Brahman and the idea of a singular consciousness. Now, again, you touched earlier on about a writer that we're both a great admirer of, Philip K. Dick. And, of course, Philip K. Dick argued in his exegesis, one of the sections on the exegesis, he was arguing that effectively we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. So the program itself, and I know that was Bill Hicks, by the way, but I'm very much praising what Phil himself wrote in the exegesis as well. Now, this is then an interesting idea, isn't it? Because it suggests that the ground state of everything, the hard drive, for want of a better term, is everything. It's the totality, it's the unitariness of everything else. And we are all just emanations of this. And again, it's something you again touched upon earlier on when you were talking about if you are in the program, when you are normally in a simulation of one description or another, you carry into the simulation the fact in your brain that you remember the fact that you are somebody within a simulation. But of course, as Philip K. Dick could argue, you could actually have your memories wiped clean of the fact that you're in a simulation. And of course, there has been an argument to say that the collective consciousness, God for want of a better term, if it wanted to embody itself into a huge simulation, it would forget the fact that it's God, forget the fact that it is a single entity, and it is experiencing itself subjectively. And, this is anamnesis. This is very much the old Greek idea of the drinking of the waters of the river Lethe, the forgetfulness. You drink, you when you die, you actually drink the waters of the Lethe, you forget who you used to be, and you go back into the simulation. So there's a lot of historical perspectives here, and I think, to me, I'm at ease with the idea of believing that the information field is what there is, and we're all experiencing it in some way. Now, how would you convince somebody out there when they're listening to this saying, what evidence have you really got for this? We're hypothesizing about future civilizations, and the idea of I'm reminded of, I can't think of the guy now, wrote a book called The Physics of Immortality, who came to a similar conclusion, one of the guys that was behind the cosmic anthropic principle. And indeed,
Frank Tipler.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, it was Frank Tipler.
It was Tipler, wasn't it? Yeah, The Physics of Immortality. Mm-hmm. Now, as a grounded scientist yourself, what is it that leads you to suspect that Bostrom is right? And what is it about physics and science and the present state of physics that leads you to believe that the simulation argument is probably the best option we've got for them to this mystery of how consciousness exists. In other words, how my consciousness, which does not have extension in space nor indeed time, and I know in your book you actually write about the concept of time as well, and the work of Barber and various other individuals. What convinces you, as a grounded scientist, that this could be the explanation?
Well, first of all, I do have to admit I'm not, really a scientist. I took plenty of grad level physics classes and did fine in those, and probably would have gone down that path if it weren't for the fact that I was, a little bit more interested in, a career where I could make better money. I think that's why I went into engineering. So I was always fascinated with physics, but I don't have a PhD. But I don't know that makes not a scientist. I can conduct the scientific experiment very well. I understand the scientific method and what it means. And you touched upon something recently, or just a couple of minutes ago, that I wanted to expand upon, which is, the idea that the question about what is science. Nothing is fact. Everything is a theory. And even the theory of relativity that has been shown to be very accurate, theory of quantum mechanics, other theories, they evolve over the years. And, what at one point is just something that's based on a lot of evidence, later on some evidence comes along that makes you need to modify that theory or rethink that theory or entirely throw it out. So all I'm talking about is a theory that does have some evidence. It has some supporting evidence, even though, in some cases, maybe there's some falsifiability in there, but it's testable. There are people doing tests now on whether or not our reality is digital. It's observable. It's actually predictable. So some of the hallmarks of what a scientific theory is actually do kind of fit into this. So getting into your specific question about what is it about the research that's been done today that leads me to believe in this? I'd say the core thing is probably the observer effect. As you know, there's a famous experiment that people have referred to as the most beautiful scientific experiment ever, which is the double slit experiment, which has some just astounding implications. It was initially done with light and then later on done with particles. And the first interesting aspect of it was that it appeared to show both the wave and the particle behavior of either light or particles. But the more interesting aspect of it was that when somebody interacted with the experiment to the point where they tried to detect which of the two slits the particle or the light, the photons went through, as soon as they tried to detect that, the result of the experiment changed. And so that was curious for a lot of people, and most people originally said, well, it's because the detection is interfering with the experiment itself. So if you were to remove those detectors, then you get a different result because those detectors are stealing a little energy away or something like that. So over the years, different research labs have been coming up with more and more creative experiments. So in 1998, for example, the Weizmann Institute came up with an experiment where the reality actually shifted depending on the amount of observation. And then they did things like the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment and others where the actual detection of the slit that the particle went through wasn't made until after the pattern was put on the screen. So that
very importantly, Jim. Jim, just very quickly, it's very important that you explain to the audience exactly what you mean by the delayed choice experiment, because it is stunning in its implications. Can you just go back a little bit just to reiterate exactly what this experiment showed, because it is mind-blowing. So if you could just go back and just explain that to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage people to Google this and kind of read about it. So in the double slit experiment, there is an interference pattern that is on the screen, and if you put a detector between the slits and the screen, then that detector will determine which slit the particles went through. In the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, detection is completely removed from that time frame where it's between when the particles go through the slit and end up hitting the screen. So it can only occur afterwards. They basically take the stream of particles and they split them using mirrors and lasers and so forth, so that one stream is going through and one stream is going somewhere else, and they recombine them later. But the important part is that the actual detection of which slit it goes through happens after the particles hit the screen. And yet, when humans observe that, that result, the screen will still show the what they call the collapse of the wave function, or the fact that once we know which slit it went through, even though we know it after they hit the screen, then the screen appears to indicate that we knew it before it hit the screen. So it's almost like a retrocausality, almost like something is happening after the fact. But it could possibly be that the interference pattern happens on the screen, but an instant later, when we realize it, it disappears. So, the detection, the fact that it's happening afterwards, kind of proves that there's no impact to the measurement, and it takes away all of those arguments that people made a detector was influencing things. So it really seems to be our conscious awareness of the result of that experiment that changes the experiment. That's the key thing, and that's what the observer effect is. Another research institute called...
Please go on.
Okay, sure. Another research institute in Vienna, Austria, called IQOQI, IQOQI, in 2008, they, Anton Zeilinger, and did sort of, I think, the definitive experiment that put the final nail in the coffin of objective reality, and they determined to a certainty of 80 orders of magnitude that objective reality doesn't exist and only comes into being when observed. Now, this is really an amazing result. They did this at a very microscopic, subatomic level, and a lot of people will say, well, how does that apply in the macroscopic world, which is a path you and I can go down, now if you want to. But the interesting thing is, if it happens at the microscopic level, that just says something really fundamental about the nature of reality. And that fundamental thing that it says is that our conscious interaction with reality does result in the creation of some aspect of that reality.
Okay, I'll play devil's advocate here, because many people know my position on this, but I'll still play devil's advocate for the point of discussion. Many people will argue that the act of observation is in fact the act of measurement, and therefore the wave function is collapsed when there is an act of measurement taking place, not the observation by a sentient consciousness. How would you counter that argument from the evidence of the work of people like Zeilinger, who I'm a huge fan of? How would you argue that away, the argument? And I know there's Wigner's friend and various other ideas, but how would you say that, it's consciousness, it's not the act of measurement, it's the act of conscious observation?
Really good question, Anthony. And to be honest, I've been researching that a lot, and I haven't really found evidence for an experiment that separates out the conscious awareness of the result from the detection. So, in other words, like let's say your experiment results in interference pattern, but humans aren't aware of the results of the post-screen detector in the delayed choice case. We're not aware of it. We're not allowed to see that. Well, you would think that in that case, it would stay an interference pattern until somebody, say, opens up the envelope or reads the data for it, and then it would collapse back to a double slit. But nobody's done, as far as I can tell, I can't find anybody's done those experiments. In the end, I'm not sure that it really matters. If we're going to observe it, perhaps the system is aware of that and collapses the wave function anyway. But it's a really good question, and I continue to kind of research that as well.
Yeah, because these are areas that fascinate me as well, and of course that was the whole point of Schrodinger's cat, and the idea that, the wave function is collapsed and it's not observed, does it actually continue to be in two separate realities? But of course, this is the whole argument that you mentioned earlier on about the many worlds interpretation. Of course, this was Hugh Everett III's solution to the collapse of the wave function and the observer effect. And of course, he would argue, or he did argue in his PhD thesis, that in fact it continues, and the way it continues is that there is two observable realities, both dependent upon the viewpoints of the observer. Of course, this then starts to make you think about computer games, doesn't it? You know, the idea of, or within a computer game, within a computer simulation, everything that can happen is already in the simulation. So maybe we can touch on a little bit of the ideas that could bounce out from that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are other sort of avenues of inquiry that you can go down that lead you to the same conclusion, that consciousness is separate and that observation helps create reality. It doesn't have to necessarily be, you know, the results of the double slit experiment. But when you add them all up, there's a really compelling case for this. So one example is there's quantum Zeno effect, entanglement. So entanglement is a puzzle to everyone because they notice that if you observe two particles, you get two particles close together and make an observation on particles, they suddenly behave as if they're one particle. In other words, whatever one does, the other one does, and you can thereafter separate these particles theoretically by light years. And I know they've only been separating them by miles, but they continue to push the boundary of how far they can separate things out and still verify entanglement. And one of the things that they're verifying when they do this is there any delay between the behavior of one particle and another particle, such as explained by communication at the speed of light? And of course, knowing, you know, Einstein's relativity, information can't travel faster than the speed of light. But what they find is that no, the speed of light is basically instantaneous. When one particle changes, the other particle changes, and they could be light years apart. They're going to instantaneously change at the same time. So what explains this? Well, and this is where the video game model gives us a really good model for an explanation for this. If you think about a video game, let's imagine some, you know, kind of fantasy game where we're all external players, we have avatars in the game, and we're, you know, interacting with each other, and there's some sort of landscape of a fantasy world, and there's a room there or a little building or something, but there's no way to get into the building. Well, the computer program that's generating the game doesn't need to design the inside of that building. In fact, it would be very inefficient for it to do that, just like it would be inefficient for it to design the inside of a tree or, design the undergarments that all the characters are wearing. If they can't be seen, it doesn't need to be designed. It's just wasted CPU cycles. So you got this room, and nobody's ever gone in it. There's no need to design the inside. Now, all of a sudden, the program, for whatever reason, puts a key somewhere, and somebody finds it, and they're able to now unlock the door and open the door to the room. Well, as soon as they do, the efficient thing for this program is to now dynamically generate the inside of the room based on whatever, based on expectations of the players, based on the design of the times, whatever it is, it'll just create that design. So this is what's called dynamic reality generation. It's commonly used in computer programming, especially for these massively multi-online role-playing games. Well, what does that have to do with entanglement? Is that it's really the same thing. We've seen that particles seem to be in this sort of probability space that's called the wave function, but it's not until you actually observe them that wave function collapses. That was the metaphor that Niels Bohr had used. And it collapses into like a definitive place and a definition or whatever for those particles. So the act of observation means that now we have to lock into it because we are observing. So since we're observing this thing, we have to make it real in the sense of having a definitive position and a definitive velocity and direction or whatever. So once we lock that in, how do we lock it in? Well, we define properties of those particles, and the properties could be their spin, it could be how they behave, how they respond to other things. And in fact, in the computer science world, that thing is called a finite state machine. So it's basically a little bit of a program that responds to stimuli in a certain way according to certain rules. And at this point, now our particles are going to be responding that way. And they're locked in at the same time. Therefore, they're following the same finite state machine. You can take them miles apart, and they're just going to keep on interacting the same way. So this model perfectly explains entanglement, explains something else called the quantum Zeno effect, and other things. So it's actually a very powerful model in that sense.
Yeah, because again, the quantum Zeno effect is something, again, it's weighing into Atano, wasn't it, as I recall. And again, the quantum Zeno effect is quite fascinating because I think, as I recall, it's the idea that as long as you watch the subatomic system, it's like watch kettle never boils, that effectively the wave function never collapses because you continue to observe it, but the moment you cease it, just like Zeno's effect. And this, again, these are little things that, and I always find this, that there's kind of little things that you come across and you think, that's a clue to the reality. Because one of the things you touched on earlier, and I think maybe the listeners need to be aware of this, is that there are two real areas of physics, modern quantum physics and modern physics full stop. And we have the Einsteinian idea of relativity. And then we have quantum physics and the standard model of quantum physics. And of course, both these systems are very, very effective. The Einsteinian system and the relativity system works for very, very large objects, and the quantum physics and the standard model works very, very well for subatomic particles and very tiny things. The problem is that the two systems are completely mutually exclusive, in the sense that if you apply the maths of one to the other, you end up getting infinity. So therefore, there must be a deeper level of reality, a deeper functioning, for want of a better term, where quantum physics and relativity can work together. Now, this is self-evident to me that effectively, as a huge fan of the writings of David Bohm, I would say that David Bohm had it right when he said about the implicate and explicate orders, in the sense that at a lower level of reality, that there is something more. There is something where the variables break down. Now, again, David Bohm would argue that when you have two entangled particles, and effectively, if you do an effect, you measure the location or the spin of one particle, the other particle's spin immediately collapses within the other particle instantaneously. David Bohm would argue at a deeper level of reality, that particle is in fact one particle. And all you're doing is you're affecting the particle instantaneously. Now, if we argue that this is a form of computer simulation we're existing within, we don't need to go down the route of distance or time, because both time and space are constructs of this program. And effectively, outside of the program, there is no time and there is no space. So therefore, instantaneous communication, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, is perfectly applicable. And it's because people understand how computer programs work. They understand when they play a computer game. But effectively, they never ever realize that this is how we perceive reality now. Now, I know in your books you touch in upon how we perceive reality, how the brain processes reality. So I'd like you to touch on a little bit about this now. I'm aware that we could go on for hours on this, and my apologies for going off on tangents, but having your attention for a time, because you're somebody I've wanted to speak to for so long, and what I'm doing is now I'm enjoying the discussion with you. But I suppose we must get back to what the audience are interested in. So in terms of the simulation itself, how does it, what is the point of it? Why are we in it? And what is the point of it?
Yeah, so, oh my gosh, Anthony, you and I are just in lockstep here, because everything that you just said, I'm just, dying to comment on, because I agree with it and want to add to it. So, there's so many, you're right, we could go on for hours. And let me get to the point in just a second, but I did want to first say the thing about all one particle and Bohm's model of implicate order and so forth, if you think about the way I described it before, that one particle is the finite state machine. So if you have particle A and particle B that are following the same finite state machine in a computer model, it just means that they're data elements in the computer model that get updated in the clock cycle effectively. So the definition of particle is some data element that gets updated, and if it's being done in the same clock cycle within that same finite state machine element, then it is effectively the same particle, and it just completely explains this. So what's the point of all this? I mean, that's really the great question, and I go back to some of the things you said earlier about Kabbalah and some of the esoteric research or experiences, the Greek philosophy. This, to me, if you take a step back and look at the greater landscape of spiritual experiences in different cultures over time, the similarities and the confluence of that, it lines up so well, you have to kind of smack yourself in the head and say, well, we'd be silly not to wonder if there isn't something to the fact that this is all consistent. And I think what it is that people in different cultures have had what's called a spiritual experience. There's a book called Brain Wars. I forget who the author was, but he talks in it about what a spiritual experience is. And some people have had this where they go into a state where they kind of separate, not necessarily out of body, but they kind of separate from their reality and become one. They start one with the universe or however they want to describe that. Those experiences have been experienced by prophets in different religions, and I think they tend to be the sources, the roots of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, other religions and religious thought constructs over the years. And they're very similar, and the similarities include things like we are all part of one thing. We are connected, and that this is where we deviate a little bit from one religion to another, but one is that we reincarnate. And you'll actually find that in the more pure, original spiritual roots of even the monotheistic religions, which later on were changed to teach that we have to be good so that we die and go to heaven. If you think about that, that sounds like a bit of a control process, and that's humans controlling other humans. But the roots of this are more in a cyclical model where we do reincarnate. So by itself, that's evidence. And in fact, there's tons of evidence on near-death experiences, on people who have done past life regressions, all of these kinds of things. If you look at the data, and some of those show corroborating evidence that you can't explain scientifically, you can't explain through other means. So you what it is, and you say, all right, this is real evidence that there is something to an afterlife and a reincarnation. So getting to the point of your question, if we are periodically reincarnating, our consciousness is separate. It makes sense that we might do this. We might play a role in this reality learning lab for a while, for some purpose, and then disconnect from it, and then reconnect and play another role. That is what the reincarnation would be. What is the purpose of that? Well, according to all of this research and all of this huge body of spiritual history, as well as people under hypnosis, people who have experienced these things directly, the purpose of this is to evolve your consciousness, to become more loving, more giving, more of service, more patient, more whatever it is. And I don't know what those goals are, but in some sense, in the way Tom Campbell describes it, is the greater system wants to evolve. And the way it's evolved is to break itself up into little pieces and ask those little pieces, which are us, to evolve. And we evolve by experiencing this reality and learning through life lessons, and then continuing to go through that cycle. So the bigger picture is that we are constantly in a cyclical process, a continuous improvement loop, if you will.
I'm reminded an earlier guest of this program was Danny Rubin, who was the brains behind the scriptwriter and the author of the movie Groundhog Day. And of course, this is exactly message of Groundhog Day, isn't it? Effectively, you live the same life, all lives, over and over again in order to reach perfection, to reach that state where you're allowed to move on to the next day. I would use the analogy, it's actually winning the game. Now, again, the stuff you say is just music to my ears. The synergy between what you're writing or what I've been writing about is absolutely phenomenal. It is unbelievable. I mean, I reread your book last week, and I remember there were so many notes I'd made on it on Kindle, because the synergy is just incredible. And I think there are a handful of us, maybe a few more across the planet, who I genuinely believe are joining the dots, because what we're doing is we are people who do not have any necessary belief systems at all. What we're doing is we're putting together the information and going, gee whiz, that makes sense, this makes sense. And we're slowly pulling together. I mean, for instance, sort of Tom Campbell's been on my shows before, and Tom Campbell and I have done a couple of interviews together as well. And we're all coming at it from subtly different angles. Have you come across the work of Bernard Haisch at all?
Yeah, I have. I can't put my finger on it right now, but the name does sound familiar.
Okay, Bernard wrote a book called The God Theory. Bernard is an astrophysicist at Menlo Park, and he's also one of the world's leading experts on zero-point energy, the zero-point field. And again, his conclusions he comes to is very, very similar. It's again the idea of there's a collective Ein Sof, or whatever we want to call it, that we are part of. And again, it was something you said quite fascinating earlier on about what I'd know as the oceanic experience, the thing that the great researcher Buck used over 100 years ago, and the idea of there's a kind of a collective something. And I mean, Tom Campbell, yes, he would call it I can't remember Tom's terminology for it, but yes, the kind of the thing behind everything, because Tom loves his 3-word acronyms, doesn't he? But effectively,
AUM, I think.
Yeah,
absolute on something manifold, if I remember right.
Yeah. Now, I'm thinking along the lines here that it would be really fascinating to get you, myself, and Tom together on one of these shows, but then again, what we do is we go off on tangents, because I'm so much wanting to talk to you about books. I keep forgetting out there that there's going to be people listening to this, but I know that the nice thing is that an awful lot of people out there are very aware of my work and your work, so therefore we don't necessarily have to fill in the bit missing pieces, because they'll fill it in. Now, I'm aware that we're down to about the last 5 or 6 minutes at the moment. So what's your plans for the future now? What's the big thing that you're involved in now?
Well, actually, I've just outlined a new book, and the Universe Solve also I signed a deal with the German publisher, so that'll be translated into German pretty soon, which is a good thing. I have a day job, so 9 to 5, I'm doing something different. I'm actually helping companies become resilient and agile, and there's a lot of overlaps in terms of sort of mindfulness and empowering people and things like that. And the values of the theory that we've been talking about. So there's a little bit of overlap to my day job, but I don't have a lot of cycles outside of that to make progress on things as much as I'd like to. That said, I am working on. I have a set of models for all of these anomalies and how they're explained, and I've got graphics for all of them, and I think they're going to be a core part of the book, as well as the bigger picture, which is how scientific and how powerful it is to recognize how much it explains, and why that is a valid scientific way of looking at things. So that's my goal in writing a new book. Is going to just take off from like all the kind of discussions that we talked about today. The previous book was very fundamental in that sense, and this new one will just explain so much more. So it's a thing. I've also updated the website quite a bit, and would like to ultimately put together a course in digital philosophy, and maybe an online course or something, and teach that would be great, because I think spreading this idea, this information, and having other people kind of contribute to it, we all build on each other's ideas, and that synergy between different people thinking on it is really what's going to, I think, make this happen. The one final thing is, I have contributed to a book that's going to come out this year called The World Transformed. And my article was about how the digital consciousness-driven philosophy can really transform the world. That kind of transcends a lot of these, arguments about things. And instead you start thinking about, if we realized that this was the case, we would behave differently. We wouldn't be involved in petty wars, and we wouldn't be so, individuated and scraping for resources. And we might think about life a little bit differently. And instead of, focusing on extending people's life to the point where they die without dignity, instead focus on making their lives better when they have the time to do that. Focus on improving quality of life during life, and allowing the fact that we're probably going to end up going through this process again. So I think it has some real implications for a positive view of the future of humanity, and that's maybe perhaps even the bigger picture here.
Wow, that's in music to my ears in so many ways, because particularly hearing you using the term mindfulness as well, because I'm involved in a group of people that are meeting in the House of Lords over here in the UK, where we're discussing ways forward for mindfulness. But it's the idea, isn't it, that it seems to be that the program is becoming self-aware, don't you think? I mean, this is the intriguing thing. If we are within the program, and we are entities within the program, we're now becoming aware of the fact we're in a program, which is almost an evolutionary step. I'm again reminded of Philip K. Dick in his book, The Divine Invasion, where you actually have the embodied God Mani, who starts to become aware of the fact of what he is. And again, one of Phil's central themes was this idea of becoming aware of what we really are. Now, could this be that this is the secret of the ages? Could this be that this is what the esoteric traditions have been teaching for centuries? Mm-hmm. Is what we are talking about now. So this gives us a very, very interesting train on the future. Now, again, individuals like you and I think we are a problem to a lot of people who don't like what we're doing. And I think the reason people is because they can't put us into a category. They can't place us in as kind of new age, woo-woo people. We're actually doing the science, and we're doing it in an open-minded and consistent way. And I think that's why we're probably more dangerous. And I think that's why a lot of people want to place us. I find my books, it drives me mad. I go into bookshops and my books are always placed in the new age category. And I move them into the popular science category, because we can't be cordoned off. Our ideas are much, much greater than this. And I think I'm really keen to have you back on the show again, because I think that, we've only scratched the surface. Now, everybody else here now as well, if Jim can just quickly tell your website, your book and everything else so people can contact you, because believe me, Jim, although Jim probably knows the term, doesn't know the term, Jim is an Atlantean. And he's part of the same thing that we're all struggling with.
I know the term, yeah.
Great, okay. So, Jim, if you can tell us a little bit of how people can find your work, everything else, and any other contact details you can give, that'll be really great. Thanks.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Anthony. So the website is called theuniversesolved.com, all one word. The book is also called The Universe Solved, so if you Google my name or that phrase, you will find the link to the page on Amazon. It'll come up right in the first page of results. That's where you can buy the book, either in Kindle or hardback form. It's the first printing of it. The hardback book is almost gone. So I'm going to start looking for a publisher for a paperback pretty soon. And on the website, you can find a link to Twitter feed, which I haven't been using much recently. I've been posting more things on the Facebook page, Universe Solved. For whatever reason, it just seems to be a little bit more interactive. People can spend a little bit more time responding to things. So in terms of connecting, feel free to follow the Universe Solved Facebook page. Feel free to contact me. My contact information, email address is right on the website as well. And I like sharing information and hearing people's stories and sometimes collecting evidence for this theory. And Anthony, thank you much. It was a stimulating hour, and I really look forward to talking to you more about this.
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you very much. And as a final point, one of the things on your Facebook page that you put up recently was a photograph of you with the actress Evangeline, and I can't think of her surname, that was the girl in Lost, Freckles. And I thought, you lucky bloke.
Yep.
Cool dude. Quite good, quite good. All right.
I go to Comic-Con every year with my son, and she was there, so it was fun.
Very nice, very nice. Lucky man. Right, okay, thanks very much again. And as usual, thanks again for Dia Nunez over there in Denver for being the person that makes this all happen, because without Dia and our H2O network, this show would not happen. And thanks again for listening in. And Jim, superb show, really, really fascinating. We scratched the surface, but at least I'm hoping that it will push an awful lot more people towards your work as well, because believe me, The Universe Solved is well worth reading. It is a life-changing book. It is powerful and it is precise. So thank you very much again, and we'll be seeing you soon for another edition of Consciousness Hour. Thank you very much. See you again.